like to talk about the whole book at some point. Yeah. Just do a quick.
Well, welcome back from the coffee break.
Thanks.
Well, the problem is that from the podium, I may also not be able to see that well.
And you'll see them. You'll see them down there.
Yeah.
So this session also has a very ambitious title. It was called the New Economic Order. So we're going to discuss, how the world economy is reacting to significant changes in trends. We have a very important demographic transition. We discussed this morning issues on climate change. We have the beginning of an important change in the world trading order. We just had a very in-depth discussion of the technological opportunities and challenges that AI is creating to the world. And then on top of that, on the financial system, we have a very interesting discussion on the future of the dollar, the role of the dollar as the center of the international financial system, and where is that going. So we have a great panel to discuss many of these issues. We have to my, let me change the order depending on how we sat. So Eswar Prasad is a Tolani Senior Professor of Trade Policy at Cornell University. Previously, he worked at the IMF. Eswar has a PhD from the University of Chicago. And he has a book coming out that is called The Doom Loop, Why the World Economic Order is Spiraling into Disorder. So hopefully he will provide us a summary of the book that is coming up early next year. Alexia Latourte is a distinguished non-resident fellow at the Center of Global Development. She was the Assistant Secretary for International Trade and Development at the United States Treasury Department under the Biden-Harris administration. In this role, she was a top policy advisor on climate, environment, and infrastructure, development, finance, and policy. Alexia conceptualized and led the implementation of an initiative to evolve the multilateral development banks to be fit for purpose to help countries address the 21st century global challenges. She has more than 10 years of experience at the World Bank. She also was part of the Obama-Biden administration as Deputy Assistant Secretary for International Development Policy. She holds a BS from Georgetown and an MA from Tufts University. And then to her left, it's Laura Alfaro. Laura is the chief economist of the Inter-American Development Bank. She's on leave from Harvard Business School, where she is the Warren Alpert Professor of Business Administration. She served as Minister of National Planning and Economic Policy in Costa Rica from 2010 to 2012. She's a co-editor of the Journal of International Economics and the World Bank Research Observer. She has published very widely. She has a PhD from UCLA and a BA from the University of from the Universidad de Costa Rica, and a licenciatura from the Pontificia Universidad Católica de Chile. And obviously Simon Johnson, who will help us put all of this into context after we hear all the presentations. So we will start with Eswar, with a discussion on this new world economic order. Then Alexia will discuss the challenges that the multilateral system is facing today. And Laura will help us try to wrap everything that we have heard today in a Latin American context. How is Latin America reacting to what we are seeing in the world economy today? So Eswar, please.
There is a problem with my book. Until I heard Simon talk, I didn't realize there was this problem. The book is coming, there are translations coming, but there is no comic book version. I'll have to fix that.
GTP.
That's not the only problem with the book, however. If there was going to be a comic, it would be a very dark comic. It was not meant that way. When I started on this journey of writing the book about 3 years ago, it was a very simple project trying to understand what was happening in the world economic order, and I had a fairly straightforward thesis that in the 1990s, after the breakup of the Soviet Union, the US was the dominant power in every respect as a military, economic, and financial power. And now the distribution of economic power is getting a little more evenly distributed. So as an economist, you normally think that competition is good for discipline, for efficiency, and for stability. So the book was going to be a story about all the forces that would drive us back towards a more stable world order, perhaps with some instability along the way. Unfortunately, I concluded that most of the forces that I had in mind might in fact lead us to instability rather than stability. Laura Alfaro has done excellent work on making the point that globalization has not stopped. And one of the key issues of globalization was that it was supposed to lead to a world of shared prosperity. But what has happened along the way is that globalization has morphed into something that is actually no longer serving as a counterbalancing force to what is intrinsically the zero-sum game of geopolitics. The idea was that economics, free trade, financial flows could be a positive sum game that would offset the zero-sum game, but globalization itself has turned into a zero-sum, or according to some, a negative-sum game. So we are seeing, and Laura's work shows this very clearly, globalization continue, but it is fragmenting along geopolitical lines. So rather than creating bridges across this geopolitical divide, it is in fact reinforcing those divides. If you think about currencies, here again one might argue that the dominance of the US dollar has created some problems for the world, but we are potentially moving to a world where financial power might be somewhat more evenly distributed. For all that is happening in Washington, that is not quite the case. But unfortunately, in this particular instance, rather than generating more stability, it means that the US can continue to wreak havoc on the world with very little consequence. This is not because, and Simon's work, of course, bears testimony to this, institutions are very important and at the bulwark of the dollar's dominance. So you might think that the fraying of the US institutional order should lead to the dollar no longer playing the dominant role. But in international finance, fortunately for the US and unfortunately for the rest of the world, everything is relative. And relatively speaking, if you think this place is a mess, the rest of the world is in an even greater mess. But unfortunately, this is not leading to any stability. In fact, it's meant that the US can generate even more instability in the rest of the world, and the rest of the world does not have the tools to be able to cope with this. And then in the rest of the book, I go through other forces that could potentially play a stabilizing role. Let me just give you a preview. If you think about the middle powers like India, they have a very strong incentive in there being a more balanced world order, where in fact there is much more harmony between the great powers and where the middle powers can contribute to that harmony. But if you look at what a country like India is doing, for instance, and this is a slightly oversimplified view, if you think about the ability to access cheap Russian oil, you see India to a large extent standing with Russia and China. But on the other hand, India very much wants to be more closely allied with the democratic countries of the West. So in a sense, countries like India, and it's not just India, it's the other middle powers in Asia, which are in a particularly fraught position, but middle powers around the world and some parts of Europe these days look like middle powers and the great powers that they once used to be. So rather than generating balance, they are teetering from one side to another, creating even more imbalance. One could think about technology, which we heard a great deal about from Simon, which could potentially play as a role as a leveling force. If you think about digital currencies, about AI, one could argue that these give, less economically well-off people in rich countries, but also poorer and smaller countries, the ability through a set of tools, many of which are open access, to be able to compete more fairly. But instead, what we see is a lot more concentration of economic power. And again, Simon and Darren Acemoglu's book speaks to this, where you might have a concentration of economic power within countries, and one might see some of these tools, in fact, creating even more instability around the world, because in the hands of malevolent actors, now you have very powerful tools that can be used to create even more division. So what is this doom loop that I speak about? So when I think about all of these forces, the framing device of the book is that if you think about economics, politics, and geopolitics, they are stuck in this negative feedback loop. In the 1990s, again, there were many prominent historians and others who argued that the model of market-oriented liberal democracy had won. And it seemed like now we had an exemplar that the entire world could use as a model for what it should aim towards. But unfortunately, that has not proven to be the case. This combination of democracy, free markets, and globalization has proved to be a very toxic mix, because we've seen how the institutions of democracy are subject to elite capture by political and economic elites. And that has led to the ability of politicians who, in a sense, have the mood of the public at heart to be able to foster what I think of as the politics of resentment rather than the politics of hope. So this is where we are right now. One might still argue, because remember, I started out with a very cheerful thesis, and my heart still led me in that direction, although my mind was pulling me completely in the other direction. So I still wanted to give my thesis some room to play. So I thought maybe it's still the case that we are still on a path to a better place. Surely we must all recognize that there are common interests at play here. In the last part of the book, though, and this is what led to my darkness, I realized that there is a fundamental difference. If you think about where we were in the 1990s, yes, the US was a dominant power, but then it looked like Japan might start playing a role as a rival to the US, and then it faded away. In the 2000s, it looked like Europe might become a significant rival to the US, and then it's sort of fading away. A critical difference, though, between those two episodes and where we are right now is that if you think about Japan, Europe, the US, the notion of how you should organize a society, an economic system, a political system, that is very largely the same. Those shared values meant that while there might have been economic rivalry, there was harmony at a deeper level. Now we are facing an entirely different situation where there is a large power, there is a completely different vision of how economic, political, legal, social systems need to be organized. So in my mind, there isn't a very clear way to match where we are in these two extremes. So I think we are stuck in a doom loop. Surely I cannot leave my readers with this notion without telling them if there is a way out. The last chapter of the book will give you potentially a way out. All I can tell you is that it's going to be very difficult for us to get there. The path is clear, the solution is clear, but it will take a lot of hard work.
Thanks, Eswar. Well, we will try to get some of the last chapter in the next few rounds, because we cannot leave the audience with such a doom presentation. But let's follow with Alexia on the multilateral system, the world trading system, and the challenges that we're facing today.
You left us with quite a cliffhanger there, but I hope we can indeed hear more about your last chapter. And I have to say that although you speak a lot about doom and darkness, the cover of your book is quite cheerful. So I think there is still optimism where you are. No, listen, I mean, I think it's clear, at least to me, that the post-World War II economic system served us, asterisks around the us, fairly well. I mean, I think we have to note that in the 1950s, the average life expectancies was in, you would be lived to 40, and now it's about 71 globally. We've also seen poverty go from 40% of the world population in 1950 to 10% today. Still too much, but we've seen real progress. We've avoided World War III. Okay, lots of violence in the world today, but we have avoided World War III. This said, I would agree that the system we have today has an expiration date, and it's deeply strained. And I want to share with you three sort of reasons why I think it's so strained. And they are relevance and effectiveness. Number two, governance and legitimacy. And number three, trust. So starting with, is the system still relevant? Is it effective? I would say that it's not delivering well anymore, and it's certainly not delivering for all people equally. And that's true in terms of where financial flows go, where capital flows go. It's true in terms of the violence and fragility that we see. It's true in terms of stagnating important development indicators around the world. And so we see this frustration from governments and people in countries of all income levels, actually. And that's why we see the moves towards nationalism, populism, and inward facing dialogues. So why is that? I think part of it is that we are faced with a lot of novel challenges, problems without passports, climate change, pandemics, fragility and conflict, that the system has actually not been able to connect the dots between the global level, the regional level, the national level, and the sub-regional level in terms of finding effective solutions that work across this level. We're, of course, today in the first day of the COP conference in Belém in Brazil, and we see that although there is some progress, the reality is that the poorest countries in this world are still facing the greatest number of deaths linked to climate-related events. We see that agriculture in Latin America, in Asia, in Africa is really stressed in terms of water scarcity, reduced yields. And then we see that only about 10% of climate finance is going to adaptation because the focus has really been on mitigation, and that has real consequences. Also not so effective because trade, and I know you'll speak more about trade in a second, Laura, but I think, we are in a world of erratic trade policy, of supply chain disruptions. Now, Ngozi, the head of the World Trade Organization, likes to say the system is bent. It's not broken, it's bent. And she stresses that 72% of all trade in the world is still trading under WTO terms. So that's a positive message from her. But I think we are moving from a system of free trade to strategic trade, which perhaps if managed well is okay, but I think does raise some real challenges and moves us in a world of bilateral negotiations, preferential trade deals, unilateral tariffs that I think we need to think about. Thirdly, I want to talk about debt, right? So after very successful HIPC, we're seeing serious challenges with over-indebtedness, where we see about 52% of low-income countries are either in high debt distress or at the risk of high debt distress. We're seeing these countries pay about 7.2% of their GDP in debt servicing costs, often more than they spend on education or on health. And we're seeing that the system is not able to help with this fast enough, right? So the common framework is slow. It takes countries years to restructure their debt. And perhaps more importantly, the response to help countries that are near the cliff, so they have liquidity problems, but they're not yet in debt distress, the system is not stepping up to help them to avoid them going over the cliff. Financing, both public and private, is not flowing in the way that it should. So we're seeing negative foreign direct investment flows for most emerging markets, and certainly that's the case in Africa. We're seeing the cost of capital and the high interest rate environment a real challenge for many countries. We're seeing net negative flows out of countries in many cases, and then we're not able to really work on capturing negative flows like illicit financial flows that, if we were able to stop, would represent a lot of resources for countries. And then we're still seeing very high subsidies, fossil subsidies, agricultural subsidies that are frankly eating up resources that could be directed to much better uses. And then we're seeing complexity and fragmentation. which results in a lack of operational delivery, right? So we're seeing, for example, in the climate space, over 200 climate funds. And so countries don't even know where to go for resources. We're seeing a lot of intermediaries in the system. And so financing from commitments to countries to what lands in countries sort of disappears in midair to all these different intermediaries. So real issues of effectiveness and relevance. Secondly, real issues of legitimacy and governance. You talked about the fact that economic power is more evenly distributed today than it was in the past, but political power has not kept up with that. And so that creates a real challenge. We tell countries they're welcome to join clubs that have existed for many decades, like the Paris Club, but only if you follow the rules that are already established. And so we see alternatives being created, like impetus now for a borrow club. We see African countries unhappy about credit rating agencies and what they perceive to be an unfair cost of finance. And so they want to create their own credit rating agency today. The OECD DAC seems to be a bit of a dinosaur. There's a review happening now, but we don't have high expectations of what will come out of that review. And of course, since 2016, we've seen an alternative system being created. The Asian Infrastructure Bank started out with about 57 members, mostly of the Asia-Pacific region. Now it has over 100 members, including plenty of countries from Latin America. China, you talked about Japan, Europe, did it rise, not rise? China, obviously rising, but does it really want to take its responsibilities as a major power when it's still absolutely insisting that it's be called a developing country in the context, for example, of the climate negotiations that are happening right now? Question mark, I think a fair question mark. We've had 4 successive emerging market G20 presidencies, including the South African one right now. The lack of focus from these emerging market G20 presidencies on lower income countries has been striking to me. So I think that poses a lot of questions as well. And then I'm going to end on trust. Maybe not a very economic concept, but a really powerful concept. And there's a real erosion of trust. COVID contributed to that, the initial unequal distribution of vaccines, the fact that some countries that had the fiscal space, like the United States, were able to lead the recovery, but other countries were left behind. A sense of hypocrisy around the rules of the game, that there was political will to find money for Ukraine. Everybody understands the importance of Ukraine, but it just means there's no political will to find money for others. Yet when you have a champion, like the US in the case of Argentina, $20 billion can also be found. And so real deep questions of trust that need to be dealt with. So let me end on that point.
Thanks. And I mean, yeah, a very complex environment to resolve the global public goods challenge that we're facing today, and that the multilateral system has not been, as you say, delivering for the last 3 decades. No, and mounting on that, obviously an issue in which countries are moving away from globalization, from their support of multilateral institutions, and thinking, and following on the way you close, on moving towards much more bilateral solutions where maybe geopolitical objectives get mixed with economic and policy objectives. But I will turn to Laura to tell us a bit on how the trade situation is evolving, and some thoughts on Latin America.
So I'm actually going to talk more facts, but it's interesting what you mentioned at the end. My husband calls it with a little bit of help from your friends. And I think that's what's going on with the world. It has become this world that what are your friends and what are your enemies? But your friends change very often. But in the case of many regions, one of those friends was the US, and I'm of the view that the US and my European friends don't like this. The US is the anchor of this era of globalization, And so in many ways, I think the angst that is coming is around what will be the role of the US. With this co-author, David Chor from Dartmouth, we wrote a paper for the Jackson Hole Central Bank Conference on the reallocation of global trade. And we revisited some of these facts for the IMF conference last Friday. And so what we did here was we went back a little bit on the facts. And as you know, there was an enactment of tariffs around 20% against China during the Trump 1 administration. The Biden administration didn't get rid of those tariffs. If anything, there were more subsidies in different ways. And so we went back and documented some of the changes, but then we also updated with information. I have to say that it was up to July. We did ask RRA to try to do up till August, and then RRA came back very happy, and he's like, and we're like, why are you so happy? And he's like, I cannot work. Government shutdown, there's no more data. And I'm like, don't be so happy. One day we need to update this. So we will present until July. And so these are the stylized facts that we compile. First, we are not seeing deglobalization yet. I know everyone likes to use that term, but de facto, the US has actually been trading more now than before. It is true that it is trading less with China, but it has more than compensated with the rest of the world, and you see that in the graph to the left. And on the right, we show some of the main countries that have benefited. The US tends to have very stable regional patterns the last 40 years. So it's around 40% Asia, 30% NAFTA, USMCA, 20% Europe. And what has happened is when Asia loses, Asia wins. So when China lost, when Japan lost, China won. And now that China is losing, who's winning? What we call upper income Asia, that would be Taiwan, Korea. Lower income Asia, that would be Vietnam, but also middle income Asia, that would be India, Thailand, and Malaysia. But it has also seen a lot of nearshoring, and that would be Mexico. Mexico has also been one of the winners of this reallocation of global trade. What is interesting is that there has been a little bit of diversification. And so here we plot the distribution in 2017 by 2024 and by July 2025. And you do see a little bit of movement of the curves. Mexico became #1 partner a couple of years ago. Before it was oscillating, but now it's clearly the #1 partner. Even Canada now is more of an important partner than China. But the importance that Mexico has in US trade has not matched China's role. But if you look at that graph, you do see some changes in the ranking in the top 10. But when you go to the top 20, which is basically 80–90% of US global trade, is the same countries. There has not been new players in this arena. So it's reshuffling between the top 20, which may have some, if you want, negative implications for countries that wanted to get into this game. It's basically the ones that had industrial cluster, the ones that are benefiting. This is an update of the reallocation. China has lost close to 13 percentage points. It peaked at 22 in 2017, and now it has lost. And there you see some of the winners, as I mentioned, Mexico, Vietnam. Taiwan lately has won a lot. It's semiconductors. It's part of the AI revolution, some of these gains. A lot of Switzerland and Ireland was related to COVID. And also, my husband is Brazilian, and so they call it Ozempic. It's made in Ireland, and they're getting some competition from some other sources. Yes, all the Brazilians know that. So just to give you some facts, there has been a lot of loss in electronics, laptops, mobile phones, furnishings, so on and so forth. There is a very interesting fact that we discovered that I don't know how well it's known. It turns out there was a suspension on tariffs on phones and computers and iPhones because Trump didn't want a sticker price around Christmas. That never came back. So we don't pay tariffs on iPhones and electronics. Even there was a front loading of iPhones but it has nothing to do with tariffs. It has more to do with a fear of tariffs. But the effective tariff is 0 because it was suspended and didn't come back. You do see Vietnam. There is always the question of rerouting. That is very hard to know. I have a colleague at HBS who has looked into Vietnam. The products that are going from China to Vietnam are very labor-intensive products. And China development is paying higher wages to your people. So if you're going to put labor-intensive hand of like painting, it just doesn't make a lot of sense to do it in China. You might as well do it in Vietnam. So there is some value added, but it's very low value added. But again, that is always the big question. And Mexico is seeing a lot of products, electronics, furnishing, auto, vehicles. And the one, as I mentioned, is semiconductors, AI. We then look at margins, and I don't want to bother you with the equation, but we're trying to see what is happening at the extensive margin, number of products, and what is happening in the intensive margin value. And most of the changes are happening at the intensive margin. So again, it's reinforcing that if you had the industrial cluster, that is where businesses are going for new suppliers. Except Mexico a little bit in the first phase, but now it's all in the extensive margin, and Vietnam and India that are creating a little bit of the emerging cluster. But everything overwhelmingly is a intensive margin. We then played a little bit on what were the products that reacted on impact. So those are the products that saw a reduction from China in the first Trump phase. That would be like the purple. The ones that are what we call wait and see, the ones that waited, if you want, until there was more certainty on the policy. And so now that they found out that Biden was also not getting rid of the tariffs, that's when they acted. And so that would be the blue. And the persistent, the ones that change always. And what we found that we thought is interesting is that the products that took a little while to change were the products that were more contract intensive or relationship specific or sticky. The products that reacted faster were the labor intensive ones. And so we're seeing those that, which makes sense, as soon as there's more clarity, you move the products. But what is interesting is that in this new round, all products moved. Relationship specific, contract specific, capital intensive, which gives you a sense that firms for 8 years had time to plan for changes, and they all had plans, and they enacted the plans very quickly. So they pretty much have gone through the fixed cost of having to deal with this, and so they very quickly reacted this time. And we do a little bit of local projections. I don't want to bother you with the equations, but this is just to give you a sense of, in China, you do see a very quick reaction in loss of product shares, both at the extensive and intensive margin. And you do see an increase in prices. This has been documented. That first round, there was a lot of pass-through. 70% on average was paid by US consumers. This is Mexico. In Mexico, you see that there was a little bit more on the intensive margin, and we don't see a lot of action in terms of prices, but you do see also a very quick reaction in terms of the changing products. And so we went and looked at post-Liberation Day, and as you know, the policy has been all over. No one really knows the number. There's a lot of exemptions, and it changes by the hour. Still, it is interesting that you do see that there was more action in countries that had more announced tariffs. And countries like Mexico and Canada, that de facto was a lower, you do see these countries receiving a lot of the changes. We also did a little bit of local projections, and here notice that what we're doing is months. The previous graphs were years. So you do see the first thing is this is happening faster this round. And it's happening a lot on the different margins, but we don't see price effects. I know that a lot of people are documenting price effects. These price effects are around 2-3%. We can have a debate if 2-3% is inflation. But so far, we don't see it in prices as clearly as we saw it in the last round. But again, this is very preliminary, and we don't have August. August is an important month because it's when you start bringing your product for Christmas. And so at some point, we need to update for that. And so again, to conclude, is this a full circle moment? We do see that the US supply chain has actually been surprisingly resilient despite the shocks that it has received. It is decoupling from China, but it's diversifying. There's this little factoid that I don't know if everyone knows. When China joined the WTO, US imported 9% from China. The peak was 22%. Guess how much US imports from China right now? It's back to 9%. So what took 18 years wasn't done in half the time. And to be honest, it was not as dramatic as people would have guessed, in part because trade has continued to grow. But a lot of this that is happening with the same countries. We do think it's going to persist for many reasons. One is the products that are switching are relationship specific now, contract specific, and it's likely that those may not leave. But also, I think there is, for good, for bad, for evil, and this is work that I have been doing with David and Maggie Chen from GW. In the US, it is accepted to put protection against China. We have a paper that documents that. It might be national security, it might be loss of jobs. So that is there. As I said, it was not changed in the Biden administration. I just find it very hard to believe that independently of the government, that we're going to back to the previous arena. And also now it seems that it does have some fiscal implications. The question, and you mentioned this, is whether this new system of bilateral interactions is going to create a new multilateral system that is better. It is true that there were a lot of complaints about the WTO. I think there was a lot of hearts broken when China came in and was not playing by the rules, but then it stopped working. This might be a way to get some of those agreements. I am not as hopeful that that's going to happen, but I also don't believe we're going to go back to where we were.
Laura, I mean, these numbers are extremely interesting to see that the US was able to cut half of the trade or more than half of the trade with China with what it seems to be relatively little cost. Have you been able to, can you look at your data and see if gradually the marginal cost of decoupling has been increasing so that the next 5% is going to be much more costly? Or, I mean, according to your data, you might think, look, we are in for another 7% of decoupling and the cost will continue to be relatively small.
So it's hard to measure cost if you use unit prices. This round, we don't see the increase in unit prices as last time. But again, it's very early. So it could be that we just need to wait. The products that are harder to switch are the ones that took longer to switch. So those were the contract intensive and the relation is specific. We were shocked that in this round, everything switched very quickly. So again, I do think that firms have had 8 years to plan. We say this in the paper. There is a lot of discussion in uncertainty increase, but the uncertainty is we don't know what the number is going to be. I don't think there's any doubt that he was going to be protectionist. And so firms acted.
So Simon, maybe, I mean, another thing that Simon has been doing in the last few months, I mean, Simon was part of a group that is editing, I think, the second volume of work by many economists on the effects of the policies that we have been seeing being implemented in the US. So maybe you can, I mean, react to what you have heard, but also tell us a little bit of what is your sense of the impact of the policies that we're seeing based on the work that is forthcoming from this very broad group of economists.
Yeah, this is a CEPR volume on the economic effects of the Trump administration. We're doing a new edition, having done the first edition in the summer, a new edition probably end of November, and a new edition every month after that, to Laura's point.
Because there's no data right now.
Well, on some things. Look, I will answer that question, Hunter, but I also want to look forward a little bit because I think a fair amount about the world in 2100, when it's going to be roughly 10 billion people on the planet. And the question of how many of them will live in relatively prosperous, relatively secure ways, and how many of them are going to be very precarious or even worse. Now, two reasons for some positive feelings. One is falling cost of energy, particularly from renewables. So this is the result primarily of Chinese innovation, actually. And the cost of producing solar and wind has fallen dramatically, and the cost of transmitting electricity over large distances has also declined. So that creates this interesting possibility that more people in the world may have access to electricity at the time when electricity can bring you not only power, but it can also bring you information, and it can also connect you with the internet. So there's probably 800 million people who don't have any connection to all of the information sources and abilities to understand the world that we have. Now, those could be very positive, and I think to this point about the you should call it something like the other China shock or the negative China shock or some other the fact that China is being pushed out of some of these supply chains is, we think, creating opportunity for other countries and also probably moving Chinese investment to other countries in various ways that are completely legitimate. And so does this mean that a broader set of countries can enter into investment and patterns and trade relationships of the kind we've seen in East Asia and a few other places, but not that many? So perhaps there's an opportunity coming from the supply of energy and the supply of electricity and access to the internet, along with shifts away from China, because China was very strong in many of these segments. And I think then this links to the, how do we think about the second Trump administration? Because if it's shifting trade patterns, that could be really quite positive for a lot of countries. If it's protectionism and refusing to trade, I think that's a different story. Now, I did sign an amicus brief to the Supreme Court for the case they heard last week about tariffs. And I then followed the arguments at the Supreme Court, and I was quite encouraged that they seem to recognize that tariffs are in fact taxes on your own people. They also seem to emphasize that the Constitution says that only Congress and only Congress can raise taxes. But if they do support President Trump and his legal theory of tariffs, then that will open the door to subsequent presidents doing all kinds of things across borders for border adjustments based on carbon, for global corporate minimum taxes, for example, quite a long list of other things. So I think we don't know exactly where the Trump administration lands and ends in terms of changing the US Constitution, Alejandro, and changing what the president can do and changing what the role of the US can be. And if it's just a reorientation away from China, I think that may create a lot of opportunity for other places. I think China can also deal with it, frankly. But if it's a closing off of America and a withdrawal of America, by the way, if America is tampering less in the world, if America is less concerned with regime change or moving people's politics, that might actually be a positive. Right? It's not clear that we were always pursuing. Well, the people in Venezuela have already experienced under Trump 1 an enormous amount of pressure and an attempt to change the regime.
People who are stuck with dictators.
So I think a key issue, Alejandro, comes back to some countries inherited very difficult institutions that have struggled with them for 100 years or 200 years. Can they take advantage of whatever the world now presents them and create a better, more pro-private sector, legitimate set of institutions? I think this is on them and on the people running those countries more than it is on anybody else. I mean, it's not super fair, right? I mean, they inherited these colonial experiences. They didn't ask for them. But I think, and those are the legacies that have to be overcome. But I think there is some opportunity potentially from the various twists and turns of the second Trump administration.
Look, I think if one looks at Laura's data, I think well,
The census data.
the way you presented the data in terms of the changes in exports and export share to the US and to the other countries and the reshuffling in trade, I mean, definitely there's a lot of trade diversion, trade reshuffling that many countries can take a lot of advantage, and a lot of investment can come behind this trade reshuffling, so it can present a very important opportunity to many countries. No, I think, and then if the uncertainty it's reduced, I'm pretty sure you have positive effects on both sides, on the reshuffling and in the reduction of uncertainty. And as you were saying, I mean, looking at technological advances, I mean, AI plus the decline in energy cost and the decline in energy storage, no, with the technological changes in batteries, provides for a huge positive supply shock for the world economy. No, so I think
I do think, though, one thing perhaps we haven't stressed or mentioned, immigration is going to be much harder into the rich countries for the foreseeable future. I think the bipartisan consensus in the US will be much less, to allow much less immigration, particularly of less skilled people. And I think the Europeans will end up there also. So whatever the pressures that build up in other countries, they will not be to the extent that immigration can mitigate under some circumstances, that will become much more difficult.
And just if I may, on the point on energy, I fully agree with Simon. Also noting, however, that the demand for energy is increasing rapidly, including for our energy, water. So just we have to produce even more.
I put solar panels on my house recently. My wife and I did, not because it makes any economic sense, just because we think that the data centers are going to also a good thing to do for the environment.
so. Before we get to that positive long run, we might run into a shortage of energy crisis, Simon.
Well, it's certainly right that in the US, there's surely going to be pressure on electricity supply and water supply in some places. The building of data centers is proceeding without much constraint or consideration. And we're not building enough electricity supply to go along with that in the United States. I think the question is around the world. And renewables are a very attractive proposition. That's really interesting to put a lot of solar panels in hot places with a lot of open space and then sell the electricity to somebody who's got some money to pay for it. That already, and you can also, Saudi Arabia is already proposing to sell compute that they will produce given cheap energy, some of which will be renewable in Saudi Arabia. So the geopolitics of energy shift, I think, in ways that could be quite helpful to some lower income countries.
Maybe, Eshwar, in your book, how does the energy transition and the energy market fits into the forces that you analyze, and how migration, that's something that just came up, fits in this doom loop scenario?
Simon's work has been very inspiring in a variety of ways. His work on institutions, on technology, and so on has been very inspiring. But today he inspired me and others in a different way by arguing that we should be aiming for a Nobel Prize as well. But it occurred to me that maybe the right Nobel Prize to be aiming for is actually the Peace Prize, if one actually can think about solutions to some of these problems and ways to get out of the doom loop. Although I promise if I do get the Nobel Peace Prize, I will dedicate it to you, oh great leader who deserves all Nobel Prizes out there. It's going to be very challenging. And let me frame the issue not just in terms of energy, but a broader set of issues. We talked about how globalization has worked for a lot of countries, but we are not really seeing deglobalization, but perhaps a fragmentation. It is true that US trade has held up very well, and so far China's trade has held up very well, but there is a big problem that the world faces right now. The US still remains the country of major final demand, but China has grown through investing, and this has become turbocharged in the post-COVID period. So China, as you know, is experiencing deflation right now, and probably even more deflationary pressures than suggested by the official statistics. And even the government is taking measures to try to reduce competition so that you don't have declining prices. So now you have a wave of competition coming from Chinese goods that are flooding the rest of the world, and one other country, which is the major source of demand, basically putting up trade barriers. So what I envision is that for much of the rest of the world, which cannot deal with Chinese exports without having its own manufacturing sector and broader economy facing very significant problems, we're going to see trade barriers go up around the world. Under Trump one, it was a plausible scenario that other countries said, to hell with the US, let's move on together. But right now, that is not a plausible proposition. China can survive this, the US can survive this, but what I really worry about are the lower income countries. These are the countries that have fantastic demographic profiles, they have growing labor forces, they are just beginning to integrate into the world economy, but these are the countries that are going to face enormous pressures from these rifts in the world economy. If you think about trade, for these economies, the traditional path of developing through manufacturing-led exports is going to be very difficult because they are coming into maturing in a very different environment. If you think about the availability of financing, the large advanced economies are soaking up a huge amount of the world's savings through their increase in government debt. And of course, many of these still remain very good places to invest, especially the US. So as you think about these forces, and then if you add on top of that, the lack of consensus right now on how to approach climate-related issues, at least from one of the major powers in the world, even though the economics are certainly leading us to a future of more renewables, this is going to create enormous pressures in these countries. The pressure for greater migrant outflows is going to increase, but this has created enormous political instability in the recipient countries, and we are seeing the consequences of that. So I worry a great deal that the effects of this instability are going to be felt particularly by the vulnerable in the richer societies, but also by the more vulnerable countries.
So in a way, you're also predicting, I mean, significant political instability in emerging countries faced with this significant push that affects industrialization and affects development. Obviously, the lack of possibilities to migrate or the significant increase in cost of migration generating important social problems in emerging markets in a way.
Yeah, I worry a great deal that we could end up seeing even more polarization in the larger countries as a consequence, more rich countries, but also in the developing countries, the escape valves will essentially be gone.
So I was in this conference, Philip Lane, the chief economist for the European Central Bank was there, and he was mentioning that the patterns you describe about China, that they're exporting, it's actually now a problem for Europe, because there is this very interesting fact about Mexico. Mexico integrated a lot to the world economy, and in every other country that had reached that level of integration, it came with a lot of development, and you wouldn't see it in Mexico. Mexico lagged in terms of growth and productivity. And one hypothesis is because Mexico was directly competing with China. And so whatever happened to Ohio happened to Mexico. It was in direct competition with China. But China has also grown in the product space, and now is in direct competition with what Europe produces. And so that is actually likely to create a lot of tension in Europe, which is probably also going to create within Europe because it won't be the same in Germany as it would be, for example, in Spain. But the patterns, I think, also are going to create problems in some of the rich countries.
That's a very important point, Laura, because it's not just Europe. If you think about the UK and its economic dependence with China, if you think about Japan, India, these are all countries that cannot afford completely to push China away, but at the same time, they're terrified about being swamped by Chinese exports. And this could lead to, trade barriers going up in a more generalized way. So what Trump may have set off is actually a sort of new era of protectionism. And again, this is very specific to this juncture because of where China is right now.
Then on AI and all of this revolution energy, countries that have critical minerals have also become important. And in this sense, is an opportunity, but a challenge for Africa, but also for Latin America that does have a lot of critical minerals. And the challenge is how we can manage so that it becomes development. And it's not easy. A lot of this technology, as you know, is either the processing is dominated by China, but also the know-how is dominated by China. So it turns out a lot of the mines worldwide are Chinese foreign ownership. So there is a challenge to see how we can turn this into development with all the additional concerns of environment, so on and so forth. But it does create an opportunity to countries that were lucky geologically. I have to say my country, Costa Rica, was not one of those. We have a lot of mosquitoes and then biodiversity, but we don't have a lot of lithium.
You're on that front.
And we don't have a lot of lithium and rare earths. But the rest of Latin America actually does have a lot of.
A lot of great people, though.
We have a lot of
That
great
helps.
people. Not even that. We're only 5 million.
And Alexia, on the multilateral system, and I mean, on the one hand, in the last 7 years also, and you talked a little bit about legitimacy, and I mean, obviously the focus on global public goods, it's a focus that needed to be strengthened. And I think the need to shift these institutions to focus on climate change, et cetera, is the right one. But for some countries, and especially after coming out of the pandemic, you had this tension on we need multilateral financing to look at education, to look at the traditional problems of development. And within a size that it's not increasing of the multilateral financial system, this is being crowded out by the global public good. So that might have exacerbated a little bit this legitimacy issue. And now, where does the development industry go to in terms of global public goods or the traditional mandate in a world of squeezed resources for development?
I think the rub is with the squeezed resources, because I do think that the debate between climate or development is a false one. And frankly, I have never heard as eloquent talk about the importance of tackling climate change as from the group of the vulnerable 20 group, which are more than 20 countries, because they know the reality and they see it completely interlinked with their own future existentially for some countries and their own ability to develop, to have an agriculture that functions, et cetera. So I think it's a false debate. However, I think your question is super valid in the sense that when the discussion was made in the MDBs, what we started to see is actually more financing going to middle-income countries and even upper middle-income countries away from low-income countries, including with some of the MDB financing, particularly around work on private capital mobilization for climate mitigation, right? So we see the numbers completely skewing away from low-income countries. So that created a real tension. I think the other thing is that the allocation principles within the system is very clear for sort of national allocations with a prioritization for low-income countries. But in the proliferation of climate funds that I mentioned, the allocation system is not the same. And so again, you see a skewing towards middle-income countries, upper middle-income countries in the fairly large pockets of money that are in those funds and not in the sort of traditional MDB financing. So I think those questions of allocation are ones that we need to actually really resolve now and understand what both a system that has impact but also does not leave low-income countries behind looks like. And we avoided those questions previously.
Say a lot about that because my multilateral basically is mostly middle-income countries.
Yes.
So.
Before we go to questions from the audience, and I'm bringing you, Simon, to reflect maybe on some old work that you have done. How concerned are you about US public debt? Should we be concerned? Should the world be concerned? Looking at a political system that doesn't seem to be fit for purpose in terms of stabilizing the growth of US debt in the near future.
So Alejandro, as you mentioned earlier, I wrote this book, 13 Bankers, on the financial crisis that did quite well. A lot of people read it, and I thought we should do a follow-up that would sort of follow the economic logic, the macroeconomic pressures on the United States. And we wrote this book, White House Burning, on US public debt. Nobody read that book. Nobody was interested. No one wanted to talk about it. Everyone was, fixed in their own views about whether it's a problem, how big it is, and how to deal with it. And I think, and that was 15 years ago. Well, yeah, I'm not going to write it because no one will read it. But I think the problem, Alejandro, is exactly that. Thank you, but even then, I think the problem is exactly, and it's very much what Ishwar said. I think that if it isn't in the politicians' faces, particularly with higher interest rates and immediate pressures, they're going to want to ignore it. They're going to want to push it down the road. And the electorate will support them on that, right? So when does it become a problem? What form does it become a problem? Very hard to say. It's not, it's asking for trouble. We've eaten up our fiscal space. We're not in a good position if we have another crisis for ourselves, let alone for anybody else. And it's highly inadvisable. And there are softer ways, always there are softer ways to get out of this kind of fiscal situation. But I fear we'll wait too long, and then at some point we're going to have a problem. But as I was clearly instructed on the first day I became chief economist of the IMF, never forecast an event, a number and a day in the same forecast, right? So yes, it'll happen, but I'm not going to tell you when.
Yeah. So I guess, I mean, before we turn to the audience for questions, I mean, it's a good time to remember the quote of your advisor, no? That he used to say, crises take longer to happen than you think, but then they happen much faster than what you thought.
He wrote
no?
that in a book he gave me. So
Okay.
yes, I do think about that quite a lot. That's really Dornbush.
So let's open it up for questions from the audience. And there's one on the back.
Hi, my name is Jose from U.S. Guatemala Business Council. So my question is about the opportunities or how other Latin American countries could face this political atmosphere. For example, you were mentioning Mexico and how Mexico is attracting lots of foreign direct investment and diversifying the products that they're producing. And there was also like the mention of trust, and maybe there's like political uncertainty around like USMCA, but I think there's trust about like the US market will continue to consume the goods that are now being produced in Mexico. So the question is like, what are the main conditions that some countries in Latin America should be like taking a look upon to, like trying to guarantee these conditions to maybe do kind of like a leapfrog situation in their institutions and in their like attraction and friendliness with private sector?
Me? So my husband is Brazilian, and I always mention this because I'm from Costa Rica. And Latin America is very heterogeneous. Like, I gave you two examples, size and language. And I always describe Latin America as you go down, the northern part is more embedded with US if you want to trade, but as you go south, it becomes more China. And so to the point that Brazil, the main partner is China, it's not really US. And so when talking about Latin America, one does need to be careful. There is just a lot of heterogeneity and a lot of opportunities. But I don't think there is leapfrogging. I think that's usually a problem. I think everyone wants a magic wand to solve all the problems, and development, it takes a lot of work, and it takes a lot of work every day. And we need to improve our infrastructure, and we need to teach our kids math and science. We had a catastrophe in terms of education in Latin America, and by the way, in the US as well. And I have always been shocked how this gets no press time, no press time. Our kids all over the world know less math now than they did 5 years ago, and we're not talking about it. There's a lot of political reasons why we don't talk about it. But there's no leapfrogging if our kids don't know the basics. And so as I said, I think if we work to improve our institutions, if we work to improve our infrastructure, and we do the basics, I think that does open opportunities, perhaps not to the US, but there's a lot of internal opportunities that we could exploit within Central America, with South America. I think we can open up those trade routes. It is very interesting that there's very little trade within Latin America. And so in part is because sometimes it's easier to go to, or cheaper to go to Miami than go from Costa Rica to Nicaragua. And there's a lot of reasons for that. But again, I don't think there's leapfrogging. There's just work every day to try to get the thing right.
So I'd like to respond, but also deferring to the experts here, much more expert than me on the region. So it seems to me that Mexico will reach an accommodation with the US. Okay, painful and with plenty of drama. And the key issue there is back to the beginning of what was discussed at the beginning of NAFTA, which was to reduce to lower the probability of mass migration from Mexico to the United States. And I believe that net migration from Mexico to the United States has been zero or maybe negative, meaning flow back to Mexico for 15 years or something like this. It's a remarkable achievement. Okay, Mexico might wish for higher wages and so on. I get that, but on the migration front, it was really addressed. I think USMCA will remain in some version for that. But if we think about other parts of Central America, and let's just start with or focus on Guatemala, the fact that you can close the southern border of Mexico fairly effectively and keep it closed for a prolonged period of time would seem to remove the geopolitical impetus to ever consider other places such as Guatemala or Honduras as being brought into USMCA. So European Union.
West Central American Dominican Republic agreement.
So the European Union obviously was built around a couple of relatively rich countries and expanded to reach countries with lower income per capita. And in the end, you have 27 countries. Is that going to happen in the Americas?
So that's what I'm saying. There is a U.S. Central America agreement already.
But-
Yes.
Yeah, there are many agreements between the U.S., Chile, Peru, then Mexico. But what is true, and I think Laura was saying, and you're asking, I mean, there's a huge space for Latin American economic integration, trade, energy, regulation, services. So as I think the discussion was taking place this morning here on geopolitics, I'm talking about Europe. I think somebody mentioned Manuel mentioned the Draghi report and the Letta report saying, look, we have a problem with the US now, but we have had a 4-decade problem in continue to push integration. And if we significantly reduce internal barriers, et cetera, we can get a productivity boost that is much larger than what we're getting with the US. I think what both Laura and you, Simon, are addressing is, will Latin America rise to that opportunity and really seeing that they can put some political differences on the side and focus on things that will prove mutually beneficial for most of the countries and push this integration agenda? Now it looks something that it might not happen. You don't see the Latin American countries focusing on that. And I agree with you that it seems that Mexico and the US might eventually reach an agreement that continues to give preferential access to Mexican exports to the US. I think there's a question mark on automobiles, that it's half of the trade, but it makes sense from a migration point of view, it makes sense from a security point of view for the US, and it makes sense from an economic point of view if you want to continue to decouple from China, no?
Yeah, I thought that the winning proposition, again, across administrations would be security of supply chains. From minerals, where Laura said you need to make sure you get a good deal, up through lower labor cost activities into the auto industry and then beyond. That's going to be a very strong proposition to all administrations. And so if you can integrate into the US on that basis, on favorable terms, that's great. I just think that the migration consideration, it was salient in 92, 94, right? And it was a winning argument, and it's turned out to be correct. But I'm not sure that same logic is going to necessarily factor in bringing, certain kinds of jobs to some other places. I don't know.
So,
Might be wrong.
just again, in terms of the benefits of these trade agreements, I don't think people know this, but the number 2 source of biomedical devices in the US is actually Costa Rica. Mexico is number 1, and Germany, depending on what you count. But the other one is Dominican Republic. So in some niche products that has been some success. The problem with a lot of Central American problems goes back to your Nobel Prize winning its institutions. So it is very hard in some of these countries because of violence. And let me end at least there. There's more. Nicaragua is also not a democracy and it has had many issues and so on and so forth. But interestingly, in terms of migration, whether you like the approach or not, Salvador, which used to be a country that would send a lot of migrants to the US, they're also coming back. Again, you may be in favor against the way the violence was solved, but actually people are coming back, and that actually is bringing some challenges to El Salvador, because now they need to create jobs for the people that are coming back. But that is also I still think that the US does see it as a point, trying to limit some of that migration. And in fact, I think a lot of support to the region are to countries that have limited some of those, or that will work with trying to limit some of those. But the bigger point is, how do we get countries in Latin America to trade with each other? I think in South America is the biggest challenge, because they still have a lot of barriers related to, again, a lot of issues. And I think some are trying to work on it, but not all of them.
We have time for a couple of more questions.
There's a hand there. Yeah.
So
Hello, good afternoon. I am Somi Perez from Peru, from the Latin American Initiative and in Governance here from the Georgetown University. And I come from Peru, working for more than 7 years in the field of renewable energy and mining. And I think that the risk that now has Latin America is very huge. The initiatives and all the investments of China in our countries, we can see in every sector in Peru, in Chile, in Bolivia. So we not only need investments in terms of money, we also need that technical investment. What is the focus that China is doing now? They are investing in Peru. Now we have the electricity monopoly in Lima of the electric distribution, for example. So China also is in every moment in more mining companies in Peru, and also I know that in Chile. So, but this type of method is not considering, for example, the technical integration of these countries. We are keeping in this model of extractive countries that we are giving the resources, but we can't do that same type of industries that now China is doing, or maybe the global south, the global north countries is doing. So maybe more than a question, a suggestion is try to invest in technical cooperation in the countries that to these countries, that Latin American countries can advance also in industrialization, not in this model of extractive economies.
Yeah, I mean, I would just agree. And I think when we're talking to a lot of emerging markets right now in the context of, sort of the crisis in development, and actually, although the quantum of financing that's needed dominates the sort of media headlines, many countries talk about global knowledge, so not, knowledge from whatever the best source is, as one of their priorities, as well as sort of real long-term sort of institutional capacity building. So not consultants, but really the ability to strengthen core staff in core government ministries or key agencies. So completely agree that that's an I think, there's less attention on this part of development cooperation, but I think it's critical. And I think, with over 70% of the processing done by China in the critical minerals space, the enthusiasm around this time around emerging markets wanting to capture value is great. But being able to do that well, I mean, starts with skill sets in universities in terms of having the right skills in countries, in terms of figuring out again, the energy sources, the water sources, legal negotiations around contracts. I mean, the infrastructure, so that you can sort of not only get the process materials out, but you're building communities that have livelihood opportunities around mines, and then financing that's patient and long-term enough, because it takes about 15 years, from pit to port. And so solving all that ecosystem around really benefiting from the opportunities of critical minerals, I think deserves a lot of attention.
So we will close this panel. I think we've heard a lot about, I mean, the trends that will be driving the world economy in the next decade, how Latin America needs to react to that, take advantage of the situation in which it's not an active player in the geopolitical sphere, and it has many resources to take advantage of that. And also, I mean, looking at what has been happening in the last 6 months, I mean, the main Latin American economies has been on the appreciating side of the dollar weakening trade, a reflection of the work that has been done on strengthening the macro, having independent central banks, floating currencies, that I think has significantly paid off, and country risk has been coming down in this environment of global uncertainty and growth, and has not been affected by this volatility up to now. So I think that's a positive note for Latin America, with a lot of question marks and challenges that have been described here. So with that, I will close the panel. We'll ask you to give our panelists a round of applause, and we will have a coffee break.
We'll now have a break, a coffee break until 5:15 for our last panel of the day, conversation with Mrs. Naeem and President Ernesto Felicio.
Valentina.
Someone? Kini.
What are these for? Like for like translating?
Their microphone.
Ah, okay, okay, okay.
Under their chest.
All
and
right.
this sends a signal.
Okay, thank you.
I was told to give this back to you guys.
Oh, thank you.